With me today on the show is my good friend Benedice again, and discussing different peoples and cultures again. Today we wanted to discuss the treatment of elderly people. It seems in different cultures the whole process of growing old and how society begins to treat you as you get older is very, very different, especially as, shall we say, you approach your final days?
Well, it seems to depend in non-industrial communities. It seems to depend on whether or not the environment is harsh. If the environment is harsh, then there is a tendency, once an elderly person is no longer able to substantially contribute to their own welfare and to the welfare of the community, that there is generally some sort of a social pressure towards eliminating them. The Eskimos, for example, especially the very northerly tribes, that it's an extremely harsh environment, and anybody who can't more or less pull their own weight one way or another, even if that means being the only adult available to look after very small children while a hunting party is going out. If you can't even do that much for yourself, then they encouraged you to find a way of separating yourself from the community and therefore no longer being a burden. But there's more than one way to contribute to the community. You didn't have to be a hunter. You didn't have to be someone who could dress skins or something like that. If you could look after the children, if you could prepare the things that other people brought in, if you could do anything at all that contributed to the welfare of the community, you were still a contributor.
But even when it came down to the last bit of not being able to find anything at all to contribute.
Okay.
You're saying it was encouraged, but it was the person's individual choice.
Sure. I mean, if you've watched any of those movies where they try and get into the North American native cultures, one of the phrases that you'll hear, the translation is again and again, "It's a good day to die." That was not a throwaway phrase. When they were saying that, that's what they meant. It was quite precise. And this was generally an older person's way of saying to his family, it's time to say goodbye while I can still make the choice myself, instead of somebody else having to deal with the choice when I can no longer make it. I choose now. I have reached the end of my physical abilities, and I will take myself away, and I will die someplace. The Eskimos did the same thing.
To me, I mean, in one sense, when you first mentioned about someone going off, because they weren't of any use to the community anymore, it sounds harsh, and yet it sounds a lot more intelligent. It sounds a lot, maybe not intelligent, maybe that's not the word, psychologically healthy.
Practical,
but an attitude that recognizes death as a very normal part of life.
Yeah.
Rather than spending every dollar in your whole bank account and estate trying to postpone
death by one more minute.
Yeah.
Sure. And that's very silly. But you also have the problem of, in non-industrial communities, you didn't have these fragmented families. I mean, the nuclear family to most Americans is considered the way to live. And that's actually an extremely modern invention, and a lot of people are really suffering the effects of it, and they don't realize it, because they don't realize what they're missing.
By not being connected to all those around them.
Right, because until about 200 years ago, if you had a family, your family was not parents and children, or parents and no children, and sometimes the occasional crazy aunt or something like that. A family was the eldest living parents, at least one set of their married children, usually most of them, unless there was, some
all in one
interesting
household.
Reason for them to be someplace else. Yeah. And their children who hadn't yet made marriages or other things that they could do living someplace else. So what we now talk about as the extended family is what they consider the normal family. And we consider both parents working outside the home as being very unusual. Up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't. But not because just the parents worked. The children worked as well when they were of an age to be able to do anything at all. The ones who were not old enough to do so stayed home with the adults who were too old to go out and do the kinds of physical labor that were required of most of the people at that time. I mean, consider it, for Pete's sakes. If you have to shear your own sheep and clean the wool, card it, spin it, you can spin it for an entire winter and only wind up with enough spun yarn to make 2 blankets. Spinning is a very time-consuming job if you have to do it by hand, considering that's how they made their clothing, as well as their bedclothes and everything else that was fabric. And
Needless to say, things were handed down until there was nothing left of them.
yes, oh, literally, literally. You would have something that perhaps the highest noble in the town would be wearing one season, and they would actually probably wear it for several years. And instead of, dumping it in the garbage or taking it to Goodwill or hacking it up for rags, they might trade it for a length of cloth. And the person to whom they traded it would maybe refurbish it a little bit, and then they would wear it for a while and then pass it on to somebody else. And it would not only, trade hands a lot, but you'd also watch it going down the class ladder until the person who actually turned it into rags was probably the peasant who lived on the estate. So, but as far as older people went, until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the family of all of the generations was considered the normal thing, and it was the grandparents and the great-grandparents and the aunts and the uncles, the older ones, who looked after the children and imparted the wisdom and the knowledge that they had accumulated for all their long lifetime. While it was the younger adults who were still healthy and strong who would go out and do things like plow the fields and go pick the orchards and sit at a loom all day, or sit with a drop spindle or a spinning wheel or whatever it was that took all that labor just to keep people alive.
Whereas now, every so often, I hear parents complaining about their parents spoiling their kids, grandparents spoiling their grandkids.
How often are they allowed to see these children, and how much contribution to the lives of these children are they allowed to have? Almost nothing, especially compared to what it used to be. But with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what happened was the older people were left on the estates because they were too old to go out into the towns where the new mills and things were just beginning to get started. It was the younger people who said, this is ridiculous. We work from before the sun comes up till after the sun goes down, and what do we have at the end of our lives? Nothing. And we're told that if we go into town and work in this new factory, we can not only better ourselves, but have something to pass on to our children. So they would leave their parents behind, and because there weren't any child labor laws, the kids went with and worked in the factories too.
So the ones who were really left out of the whole picture were the elderly.
Were the elderly people who had no backup system, no contributions now from their children who are trying to better themselves, and the parents are sort of second class at this point because the children don't know what they are losing by abandoning their parents. This system
But they lost a lot.
Sure, but this system of parents and children only constituting the family is only about 200 years old. There are thousands of years previous to that.
Is that the parents and children only, is that the basic idea, do you think then, of what a family is in industrial nations?
Sure. Look around you. How many people actually
So-
have their entire family? They don't even make houses big enough for that sort of thing anymore. I mean, look at your own family. Where would you live? Where would you have to live if your parents and you and any siblings you had and any children that they had all had to share one house? They don't make houses like that anymore. And the ones they used to, what are they now? They've chopped them up into law offices and apartments and all the rest of it.
So the whole problem with what to do with the elderly, in a sense, I guess, is just an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution.
Sure, because we've forgotten what we used to do. And yet we complain about the children aren't getting the social education, not the intellectual education. They're not getting the social education, and they're going bad. Well, for heaven's sakes, look how much they are left to strange adults who have no, for the most part, have no real interest in what happens to them. You know?
It's just a job.
It's a job.
You know, not saying that they don't care, but not to the extent that a parent or grandparent would.
Right. And how many kids, you know, grandparents are living in another state.
Mm-hmm.
The parents are both working, and the kids come home to an empty house. And at the age of 5 or 6 or 7, they've been living like this for a couple of years, and they're being expected to act as adults.
But they're still kids.
Of course, and they're kids.
For a long time, yet they're still kids.
And they're coming home and they're watching horrible things on television. They're going out into their neighborhood and the same sorts of things are happening for real on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no adult who has any vested interest in taking these children and reading them stories and talking to them and passing on the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that they have found over their own lifetimes. There's no one that these kids can turn to who is not the parent. I mean, the parents are responsible for the basic discipline. I mean, that's an old one.
To argue the other side, though, I mean, it sounds like we're suggesting that things are better when we had everyone in one house.
Not necessarily.
Well, and along that line, I'm sure there's a lot of people who, as much as they love their parents, people who have their own kids now, as much as they love their parents, don't feel real secure with bringing grandpa and grandma into the house.
But that's because we have not yet, I mean, it's only been 200 years. That's not very many generations.
Mm-hmm.
And we still have some of the leftovers from when what we call the extended family used to be the normal family,
Mm-hmm.
where the oldest members of the household were the ones who were looked up to, they were revered, they were the ones that everybody turned to when major decisions had to be made. And what are now considered the grandparents are outside that nuclear family,
Mm-hmm.
and frequently they're only allowed to see their grandchildren on a by permission basis, which sometimes that's only once a year, sometimes even less. And of course, if you put that, if they've been socialized into that sort of thing, if you move them into the household because they don't know how else to act, they've lost the example of how grandparents living with their children should act. What they do instead is try to treat their adult children as young children, instead of saying, well, you haven't lived as long a life as I have, you haven't accumulated as much knowledge and wisdom as I have, but you are an adult. You do have valid contributions. And that as the children continue to mature, they're allowed more and more say in how the entire family acts. And the parents, the grandparents, have grown up with an example of you are gracious, you are kind, you are gentle, you are the patriarch, the matriarch in the best sense rather than the worst sense of the term. You're not living on your children's sufferance.
Mm-hmm.
They are not living on your sufferance. It's a complete familial partnership. And if you've grown up with this whole method of dealing with blood-related adult people, then it goes a lot more smoothly. It has its problems, granted. I mean, there's always the family that the oldest male of the family has always been an absolute tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
And the silly thing is, you learn what you live with. So the children, no matter how much they resent it, every one of the male children is just waiting for old dad to die so
They
that
can
they
become the
can
new
become the new tyrant. Exactly. So it's not
Well,
as
but
if...
in that sense, that hasn't changed much, because
No.
there are still families, whatever their structure, who really should go into family counseling.
Sure.
Because of things like that.
Sure. But that's
Um,
because you've got a long, long history that
Mhm.
somewhere along the line, somebody has to say, this is not the way to live. We have to change it now.
Well, and there's also, along that line, becoming more honest. Not, not trying to imagine a family or set a standard of living that is not realistic.
No, every
To-
family is different.
Every family is different, but to get back to recognizing that there is such a thing as healthy arguing. There is such a thing as healthy conflict. The one everyone seems to refer to back in the 50s was the old Ozzie and Harriet, where everything was peachy keen and perfect all day long. We never fight, we never argue, and so forth. Maybe for some people, but most of the people I know could never subscribe to that standard, and I don't think they should be looking at it as the one that they should be working toward.
No, because there's always a certain level of frustration, and everybody's is different,
Mhm.
where you just say, but you're not listening. And once you get to the point where you're accusing someone else of not listening,
Mhm.
you might as well, the two of you, shut up, go someplace else for a while, think about what it is that you're trying to get across to the other person, and more importantly, what is that other person trying to get across to you, and whether or not, if it has merit, why, and more particularly, if you feel it doesn't have merit, why are you feeling so strongly about it? And so that when the person presents it to you, you can say, yes, I understand what you're trying to say. These are the reasons that I am uncomfortable with this conclusion of yours. But if you grow up in this family where you have the nice, stable, they've already been through all this garbage,
Mhm.
very mature adults at the head of the family, then when the children see the younger adults squabbling over things that are silly, they can grow up with the realization that, yeah, everybody goes through the stage where the squabbling is silly. As a matter of fact, you go through a lot of stages where the squabbling
Mhm.
is silly.
Well, we just go through a lot of stages. It just, for the most part, it seems like we've forgotten those, put everything on autopilot, and we really don't keep track of what's happening. We just kind of go moment to moment and, in a kind of a unaware sort of way.
Yeah.
But I guess, getting back to treatment of elderly, seems to me that, looking at myself as a person who's going to be old someday, I want to be respected in my old age. I want to have some sense of self-determination,
And at this rate, you're not going to get it.
which to me is not that comforting. I mean, I think, to me, a human being is a human being is a human being. They all come in different ages, size, shapes, whatever. But when any human being is presumably facing death in the near future, to me, the Native American attitude seems a lot more healthy, a lot more intelligent, to say it's going to happen, it's part of life. I'm looking in the mirror and recognizing that I'm a finite creature. I have a limited time and it's going to end, and I would rather it end in some sort of way that is honorable, that has some sense of dignity, that, perhaps has some sense of it being my choice.
Mhm. But the problem is you have both the upside and the downside of it. Okay, the upside being, if you could make it perfect, then the idea that when the body has worn out, it's time to let go.
Mm-hmm.
There's no point in squeezing out that last little drip of life that is pretty much worthless. I mean, what you're doing is keeping a body going, and generally by that time, there's no mind left.
Mhm.
Just the body is sort of doing a diesel effect like an old car. You turn the key off and it goes and keeps going for a while. The car isn't running, but
Mhm.
the motor is still sort of kicking
Mhm.
over. Well, that happens with people too. So, on the upside, there should be this sensitivity to your own self that says, it's just about gone, and I don't want somebody else cranking my starter all the time when what I really need is a tow to the dump yard.
Mhm.
It should be something that permeates society, that when you have reached in your own mind, not through despair, not through overwhelming badness in your life or anything else, simply the body is ready to go.
A peaceful point of acceptance.
Right. At that point, it should be a societal norm that it is allowed for you to make the choice at that point to let go.
Of life.
Yes.
Or rather of this life.
Yes. On the downside, whenever it's a new thing, as it is to our society, rather than an ancient tradition as it is with some other societies, there's that, Grandma, aren't you ready to die yet? We want your money. And it can get very nasty. And, you hear the horror stories about people put away in nursing homes with all of their, somebody else gets power of attorney so that all their money goes, all their belongings go, and they're left in some little dump where they get a bare minimum of care, and they're not really ready to go, but they've got nothing else to do with their lives, because some of these nursing homes are run like prisons, or worse, like mental hospitals.
Mhm.
You can't leave without permission, you can't smoke without permission, you can't eat without permission, you can't go to bed without permission, you can't get up out of bed without permission, you can't get dressed without permission, you can't do other things without permission. And for people who simply have gotten to the point where they're a little bit slower than what they need to keep up with today's pace, if it's run well, this is a good place to be, because you have somebody who periodically looks in and says, do you need anything? And you can say yes or no. And otherwise, they leave you as much alone as you want to be. And it provides a community with other people of possibly similar interests, or of interests that you might develop late in your life, or whatever. But we've gotten to the point where I'm not sure whether I agree with Governor Lamb or not when he said the old have a duty to die.
Hmm.
Yes, but he didn't have the right to say it. This should not be something
It's a
that has to
personal
be
choice.
said. Yes. And for him
And I
to say
hope for me
it,
that it will be a personal choice
right.
also.
And for him to say it means that there are an awful lot of people who now think it is within their rights to walk up to someone who is, to them, old and say, you're living in my world. You're taking up my space. You're using up my resources. Get out.
To me, that's selfish. And if something is that egocentric and selfish, it's wrong.
Sure.
I guess the bottom line that I keep coming back to, whomever I meet, whatever their age or race or whatever, it's a human being. And
Sure.
to be a human being, to me, implies a certain amount of honor and dignity and demands a certain amount of respect.
But you're still assuming that, in the ideal world, what would happen is, when you became an adult, your decisions would be your own.
Mm-hmm.
And no one else would even think about possibly taking that right to make your decisions and live with the consequences away from you. They wouldn't dream of it. How unmannerly, how rude. Because if
How
I
wrong.
can take away your decisions, if I can make all of your decisions for you, who's going to be making my decisions? And what if I don't like them? Therefore, if I decide to make your decisions because I don't trust you, even if you are an adult, with no problems that should interfere with your making decisions, If I decide that I'm going to live your life and mine, then how dare I protest if somebody else walks up to me and says, I don't like the way you're living your life. You will now do as I say.
I don't think anyone has the right to do that to anyone.
Well,
But it's done all the time.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. That's the whole point. And when it comes to elderly people, especially people who are reaching retirement age or have reached retirement age or have suffered some sort of an impairment that comes not of an illness or a disease or an accident, but of the body wearing out.
Mm.
That doesn't make them lose their minds. It doesn't make them lose their abilities, mostly. But it does not make them immature, again.
What doesn't make them less of a person?
No, absolutely not. Wherever there are parents or people who would like to take on the role of grandparenting, I would like to see us go back to the much larger families for everyone. You know, granted, it's going to take several generations to get it back to what it used to be, so that it's a graceful and useful thing to have. It's not going to be an overnight, but my goodness, look at the damage we're doing to ourselves without it.
Yeah. We've tried another system and it's not working.
No, but we haven't figured that out yet,
Yeah.
or at least not to
Hopefully
the
we
point
will
where we can
soon.
do anything about it. So,
Hopefully we will soon.
but
Thank you
we
for
don't.
joining us today. And appreciate the comments and insights you shared. So,
Well, I hope it gives somebody something to think about.
yeah, hopefully. Well, here's till next time.